course page. Sorry. What we're going to be doing is an assignment based on the Stamp Act, which I don't want you to start right now, please, because we need to have the background information that leads to why this is happening. Okay, it's not going to be due till Monday. You're going to have plenty of time, but we're going to talk about the effects of the French and Indian War, what actually happens after the war is over that makes an impact in the relationship between the colonies and Britain. Because one of the things that I talked about, and one of the things that the video talked about, even though it was very choppy, and I apologize for that, is that this is a consequential war, meaning what happens in the end is much more important than what happens during the war and after the war. Okay, and you should be able to see on your screen a map, multicolored map. It's a similar map to what I showed you before, where it shows land claims and disputed land claims. Okay, and so again, we're talking about France and Britain fighting over a disputed territory. And if you see here, kind of where my cursor is, we have two forts listed there, Fort Duquesne and Fort Necessity. Those are the French and British forts that were built when neither side was willing to leave the area that they both claimed. Okay, blood was shed, there was a dispute, and then there was a full-out war declared by either side. Okay, so we don't focus on the war. You got a good sense of that yesterday from the reading that we talked about, that it really came down to Britain being willing to spend more money than France, outspend France, in terms of the fact that France could not compete in the end and was ultimately forced to admit to terms that Britain had drawn up in what became the Treaty of Paris. Okay, so the Treaty of Paris means the treaty between the British delegates and the French delegates was signed and agreed upon in Paris, France. Okay, so the big thing about this treaty is that France is going to give up essentially all of its claims in North America. All right, they keep Sugar Islands in the Caribbean, which are going to be more profitable in the end anyway than the land in North America. But, you know, France's presence in North America is essentially gone. Okay, and the British territory, because of that, is basically extending from Canada all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico, essentially east of the Mississippi River. And I'll give you a visual for that in just a second. What that means is that the British territory has essentially doubled. All right. And that's a good thing for the country because they have more claims to land and it can reap the benefits of the resources there. But ultimately, it's going to come at a tremendous cost. All right. Because the British spent a fortune, borrowed heavily to fight the war, and it nearly bankrupted the economy to the point where they've doubled their debt. And in modern terms and American money, in modern money, it's the equivalent of $27 billion with a B. That's a significant amount of money that Britain spent to win this war with France. All right. And so they're going to have the benefits of this land that they can now utilize for themselves and not have to have a dispute with France about. But it's going to come at a cost to where they're going to have to figure out a way to pay off this debt, to pay off the cost of the war. Okay. And that's going to be the problem that is going to lead to conflict between and issues between Britain and its American colonies. Okay. And so you should see a map on your screen that says North America after the French and Indian War. Okay. And so if you look here, this area in red that I'm highlighting with my cursor, this was the existing British territory before the war. So you can see they had land claims very north in Canada around the Hudson Bay, but we know this as the original 13 colonies. Okay. The land in pink is what they're going to gain during and after the French and Indian War. Okay, so the colonial holdings are doubled, now extends to the Mississippi River. They have access to the Mississippi River. They actually had to negotiate access to the river from Spain because Spain was claiming the land for themselves and was not going to be willing to allow British settlers to use the Ohio to link to the Mississippi to go down to New Orleans to trade. They weren't going to do that. All right, so they had to negotiate that. But for the most part, it's pretty well defined by these physical features. And you do see some undefined borders here, but we're not talking about this being an area of major population. Wouldn't make sense. All right. But the area that we need to focus on here is right here inside this kind of greenish yellow, kind of ugly brownish yellow. It's a mixture of all three. This really ugly bordered territory. And this is called the Indian Reserve of 1763. Okay. And what this means is a lot for the future of the country here. Hang on a second. I gotta get somebody in here. Hang on a minute. All right. Sorry about that. Let me get back here. Okay. And so what this means is this should be land that you would think eager colonists are going to want to push west for to access for, development, grow, settle on the land, grow crops. Because of the Ohio River, they don't have to be isolated and just have to live on the coast to be able to have access to trade. The majority of the really good farmland here in the South along the coast is already spoken for anyway. So most settlers at this time aren't able to get any land that is considered to be peak, desired land east of the Mississippi River, which is why we had settlers wanting to push west. But Britain is not allowing that. This land is defined as land for Native Americans. Now, why do you think that, and use your hand-raising icon, please, for this, why do you think that Britain would decide that it would be a good idea to set aside land for Native Americans? In other words, why is this land west of the Appalachian Mountains being set aside for Native Americans? What would be the reason? Use your your hand-raising icon. Why would they be doing this? Chris, record.
Maybe because if they don't, they could go to war with the Native Americans, and that would be even more debt, and they're already in a lot of debt.
Yep, that's exactly right. If British settlers pour into this region, they're going to come into conflict with natives naturally, because we know that the vast majority of British settlers are not going to view natives as their equal. They're not going to want to be living and coexisting among natives, so they're going to be trying to drive natives out of the land, which could lead to conflict. If that conflict does happen, what's going to happen is these settlers are going to be appealing to the British government for protection, which means Britain's going to have to provide an extremely high number of resources and soldiers, which could lead to a full-scale war, which, as Chris pointed out correctly, they can't afford. All right. So this is very much a precautionary situation to ensure that the British settlers moving west do not have a conflict with natives. This is a peace offering to natives, whether the natives that are living there were allies of the British or were allies of the French. Britain is in no position right now to have another war. Okay. And so when we focus on the fact that this is a consequential war, the cause and effect of the French and Indian War, the effects far outweigh the causes in terms of importance of what we want to talk about. All right. Britain's debt requires them to need money quickly to begin to kind of chip away at the debt that they've owed, because it's put their country in a position of very great difficulty, and they don't want to have to keep borrowing more money and dig themselves into a deeper hole. All right. And so what happens is almost instantaneously, Britain's going to implement new tax laws, meaning they are going to be focusing their efforts on taxing the American colonies in ways that they've never done before. All right. And up to this point, because of Britain's distance from the colonies of 3,000 miles, these colonies have really been running the show on their own. Yes, they have governors, they have, laws that, common English laws that they have to follow, but they've enjoyed a certain level of autonomy, and they've enjoyed something under what's called salutary neglect, which is basically, in a matter of speaking, Britain's had a very hands-off approach to the colonies. And that's primarily due to the fact that the British colonies, the citizens there, were buying and selling goods with the mother country. They were growing cash crops that in turn were being sold in Britain. And Britain was enjoying reaping the benefits of the colonies. And so Britain's approach was basically, let's keep them happy. But things have begun to slip because you have to understand that a 3,000-mile distance from the mother country is going to enable you to have a certain level of freedom, but also will allow you to have a different identity to where you're seeing yourself as more and more of an American than a British citizen. If you were born in the colonies, your dialect is going to be different. You're going to be seeing yourself being in a position where you're really, your identity may be in terms of ancestry, it's British, but you really don't know anything other than living in the colonies. And so that's kind of allowed the colonies to kind of distance themselves in some ways from Britain. It doesn't mean that they don't still enjoy the security of being a British colony and so forth, but things have definitely changed. And so when the war is over, Britain almost instantaneously is going to really start to change things. New laws in the government, limiting the ability of the colonies to self-govern, limiting this salutary neglect, and now having a more hands-on approach. And this all combined is going to bring a lot of irritation on the part of the colonists because really they've had so much freedom for so long, they don't know anything else besides that, okay? And it really all starts with this law right here, this proclamation law, because what this is going to do is make it an official British law handed down from Parliament, and Parliament is the governing body, the group in Britain that makes the laws, that has the two parts, the House of Lords and the House of Commons. This law is going to be handed down, applying directly to the colonies, saying you are not allowed to settle west of the Appalachian Mountains because we don't want you to get into a conflict with natives, okay? The other thing that you need to think about from the other perspective is that France, out of the picture now, basically means that Native Americans do not have any true ally. Even if there is an alliance, and I'm doing that in air quotes, with Britain, it's not as if the British are going to fully embrace Native Americans as their equal. Okay, and I'm not even saying that the French were fully doing that, but the relationship between Britain and the natives is going to be far worse than France and the natives. Because eventually, when soldiers do push west, and they are going into native territory, there's going to be conflict. And think about it also from the perspective of, if when the United States is formed, the United States is going to be driving natives out of the land as we move west. And so the theme in, this colonial history and American history is Native American land shrinking over time. And we'll talk more about that. So kind of to summarize, when new laws are implemented, tax laws specifically, the relationship between Britain and the colonies is really going to be strained. And it's very quick because Britain doesn't waste any time handing down these laws that the colonies consider to be punitive, okay? And so if we want to think about, all right, I'm a lawmaker, or let's just say I'm the King of England. I need to focus on what are the three problems that are affecting our country right now. Well, it comes down to controlling. Let me rephrase this. If I'm the king and I'm focusing on what are the issues that are affecting the colonies or our relationship with the colonies, it's focused on three topics: the lands west of the Appalachian Mountains, trade, and money. Okay? And we know now that Britain has to protect twice as much land in North America because even though France is not in the picture, you have to be aware that other countries could invade at any time and take that land back or take it from you. So Britain is still going to keep soldiers in the colonies, about 10,000 following the French and Indian War. And they need to make sure that there's also no settlers going west of the Appalachian Mountains to agitate and irritate the natives. The second thing is that colonists are only supposed to be trading with Britain. So that policy falls under basically the term mercantilism. So in other words, these colonies exist really to make money for Britain, and that's the expectation. So if you're a loyal British subject, you should not be trading with another country. But the problem is that the British government sets the prices. And if you can buy and sell goods cheaper with other countries like the Netherlands or Spain, you're going to take the risk to do that because it means more money in your pocket. And some very well-known and very well-respected American revolutionary figures were those types of people that made a ton of money off smuggling. One of them was John Hancock. He's the guy who has the very famous first signature on the Declaration of Independence, and he was the president of the Continental Congress when the document was drafted. He was a well-known smuggler and made a fortune off of smuggling. And so these laws that Britain's going to try to cramp down smuggling with are going to be targeting him especially. All right. The last thing is the finances. The debt is not going to go away, and Britain has to find a way to pay back that debt or pay off the debt. And it really is going to be focusing on the colonies, because a good portion of the war was fought in North America right next to the colonies, and the colonies benefited from that. So the argument from Britain is, well, these colonies then should be helping to pay for the war. And honestly, that approach is not asking a lot. That's pretty standard, you would think. Okay. In terms of the taxes that are being paid, think about it. Look at this statistic here. Colonists paid only 1/20th the amount of taxes of a person living in Britain. So let's say hypothetically that, a British citizen pays $100 in taxes per year. That means a colonist only pays what? What's the amount?
$5.
$5. I mean, the colonists are getting off pretty easy with this, and British citizens are going to be insistent that the colonies help pay for this. All right. So here are 3 solutions that Britain could consider if they're wanting to pay off the debt. Okay. Choice number 1 is that they increase the taxes on people living in England. Okay, actually living in the mother country. 2, they place taxes on articles of everyday use that people buy. Coffee, tea, sugar, wine, those things. Okay. Option 3 is you have colonists pay the same amount of tax as people living in England, so to even it out. All right. Now, surely number 1 is not going to be a logical answer, because all you're going to do is irritate the people living in England, and that could lead to a revolt or a conflict in England itself. Option 3 is that if you are encouraging taxes to be paid the same for colonists as Englishmen, it's going to be very difficult to collect that tax if you have people that are defiant of that in the colonies, because that distance away from England itself could make that more problematic. Even though, yeah, you could have you have a government here, you have tax collectors here, you have soldiers here, that could be very difficult, and this could actually lead to more revolt and rebellion in the colonies than anywhere else. So option 2 is probably the most practical, because you think that even if people are defiant on this, and even if they boycott or refuse to buy these goods, the overall majority of people are going to need these items of everyday use and are just going to have to go along with the idea that they're going to have to pay this tax. Okay. And so Britain really have to start approaching this situation quickly. And so a year after the war ends, they basically take an existing law and they renew it to make it more appealing to colonists. So this existing law is going to reduce the tax on goods like molasses and sugar, tea, coffee, and wine, even though it was under what's called the Sugar Act. It's going to reduce the tax from 6 pence to 3 pence. Pence is a form of currency under the English system of pounds. Okay. So the tax is reduced in half, which should make it more appealing to people who originally were opposed to it. Okay. But here's the thing. It's designed to pay off the debt. So it's in the actual language of the legislation. It says the money is going to be raised to pay off the debt between the war between Britain and France. Okay. And even more so, Britain is trying to crack down on smuggling. And if you are not going to follow the law, even as the tax is reduced, if you're caught smuggling, you could lose a fundamental English right that you have, which is a trial by jury. And a trial by jury basically is if you're accused of a crime at your trial in the courtroom, the people that are deciding your fate are a group of people from your community. Because the alternative to that is a British appointed judge. And so a trial by jury is an English right that dates all the way back to the 1200s during the Magna Carta when that was introduced, which was really the first major document that outlined rights for Englishmen in history. And here we have a situation where Britain's threatening to take away that if you are caught smuggling under this new law. Okay. So that doesn't make anybody any fan. It's not going to get any fans because of this right here. You take away a trial by jury, which people know is a very important right, and you're going to have some upset people. Okay. But if you want to know truly where the animosity toward Britain and the anger toward Britain really starts, it's here, the Stamp Act. Okay. Britain keeps 10,000 British troops in the colonies after the French and Indian War to protect the settlers. Okay. And what they're here to do is to ward off a Native American invasion. They're here to ward off a French invasion and ultimately to keep order in the colonies. But British citizens and British troops don't get along, or I should say settlers and the citizens in the colonies and the British soldiers don't see each other eye to eye. And these British soldiers are seen as outsiders. All right. And so even though they're here to protect, Parliament says that we need them there and we expect the colonies to pay for their presence because it costs the British government about £300,000 per year to have 10,000 troops in the colonies. Remember, they're not going to work for free. They need to be fed, they need to be clothed, they need to be armed, and they need to be housed, and all those things cost money. And so in 1865, Britain hands down a new kind of tax because this is a tax that even though it's something that we're going to see that is already occurring in a similar fashion in Britain, this is the very first tax of its kind ever handed down in the American colonies. And so what this means is that you are asking colonists to follow a law created in Britain 3,000 miles away that they've never had to follow in the first place. And more importantly, this law is being made in Britain without any input from the colonies. So you may have heard historically of the term no taxation without representation. And it's going to be a theme that is going to be recurring over and over and over again during this time. Where the laws are made in Britain in Parliament, there is no individual speaking on behalf directly of the American colonies. The expectation of the American colonists is that this is a British law that the British government makes that you are expected to follow because you are expected to be a loyal British subject. So what does the law actually do? It requires colonists to use stamped paper for newspapers, pamphlets, letters, playing cards, books. The paper comes from London. It's pre-stamped. It's sold to people that use paper on a daily basis. Paper is a daily used item, so it was made sense for Britain to tax it. And you have to pay the tax and show proof that you've paid the tax when you're using this paper. So whether you're publishing a newspaper or like a book or whatever, it has to have this paper on it. This was a tax that already existed in Britain, okay? And if you want to see what the stamp paper looked like, here it is. So here on the right, this is a newspaper, and you can see in the corner, it has this stamp that looks very similar to this. Notice it's designated America, the American colonies. And this is what had to appear on any kind of paper item when it came to the colonies. Now, if you're really wondering what is the event that sets in motion the revolt and anger of the colonies, it's probably going to be the Stamp Act more so than anything else. Because the Stamp Act is going to set in motion massive resistance and protesting all throughout the colonies against this law, and more importantly, against the very people who have to collect the taxes on it, the tax collectors. They become harassed. They have death threats sent to them. It's a very, 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 very troublesome situation. Okay. So let's go back to the course page real quick because we're going to talk more about this tomorrow. But I just want to point out that tomorrow, and you can do this today if you want, but there's an assignment that you're going to start that focuses on these three or this that focuses on this law. Okay. And so what you have here, and this again, just like with the Salem witch trials assignment, it's very important that you read the description about the document. We have 3 sources here related to the Stamp Act. One from the perspective of a newspaper in the colonies, a second from something that is printed in London, and a third, a direct perspective from a tax collector in the colonies. Okay, so 3 very unique perspectives. And what you're going to do is you're going to analyze these 3 documents. And when you get to the last page, I've highlighted document C here at the top because questions 1, 2, and 3 are all about document C. Question 4 is basically comparing the 3 documents collectively, C to documents A and B. And I want to talk more about this tomorrow because that's what I'm going to use part of the class period tomorrow to talk about and explain, because this is really when you start to see the anger boiling in the colonies that in many ways could say starts the American Revolution. Because I'm under my opinion has always been that the American Revolution does not start when the war starts. The American Revolution began before it. Okay. Does anybody have any questions? Because we got about 30 seconds before we wrap up here. So the assignment's not due until Monday. We're going to talk more about it tomorrow, and I'm going to show you and talk about a few more things with the Stamp Act. Does anybody have any questions before we're done? All right, then I'm going to let you